This is the Garden of Kadeshi. For 13 generations we have protected it from the unclean. The tyrannic raiders who came before you refused to join and were punished for this trespass. What are your intentions?
The Taiidani Empire had fortified their galactic holdings well. Kushan analysts aboard the mothership had finally decrypted the data from the Taiidani frigate they captured after the burning of Karak. Amongst their findings was a recording of an Imperial broadcast extolling the power of their military through the defenses set up along the Outer Rim, that consisted of heavily fortified space stations and Imperial fleets meant to interdict any ship passing through. Kushan Fleet intelligence concluded that getting themselves tangled in an assault on any one of these positions along their journey to Higara was a foolhardy idea. Fortunately, however, the spiral galaxy itself seemingly provided a natural solution to their dilemma. An alternate route was discovered that would take the fleet through an active asteroid field, and then past a large nebula that would conveniently hide themselves from the baleful gaze of the Taiidani Empire. The nebula also seemed to have no Taiidani military presence, thus making it an ideal passageway into the inner rim of the galaxy. Faced with no other option to continue their journey, Khar-Toba as fleet command committed the exiles to this new plan, and their ships began preparations to depart. The first leg of their journey, the asteroid field, did not prove much of a challenge for the fleet of exiles, despite a miscalculated hyperspace jump that caused the mothership and her cohorts to emerge among the asteroids, and not past them. But since the loss of Karak, the Kushan strike craft had become very effective at point defense, annihilating any of the space debris that threatened the mothership and her precious cargo of surviving Kushans held in cryogenic suspension, and eventually, the asteroid field and the danger it presented passed them by. As the fleet was taking stock after their inadvertent trip through the asteroids, a Bentusi exchange ship emerged from hyperspace near their position. As always, they came to trade technology with the Kushan in exchange for a certain quantity of their resources. Fleet Command, always eager to gain access to anything that could give them the edge against their enemies, readily agreed. But as they concluded their deal, Khar-Toba asked the Bentusi if they knew anything about the great nebula they were to cross. Cryptically, the Bentusi warned that they heard nothing there, and that no one returns. They then finished by stating that even the Taiidani were afraid to enter the nebula, which explained the lack of their presence inside what was an obvious gap in their defensive lines. The two races would then depart, with the Kushan continuing their hyperspace course into the nebula, and the Bentusi leaving for parts unknown. Despite the mysterious warning, the nebula was still their best chance of getting past the Taiidani military. But all the while, Khar-Toba continued to ponder what the enigmatic race said about no one returning from the nebula. What could possibly be dangerous enough to cause a race such as them to actively avoid the region of space her fleet was about to enter? For better or worse, the Kushans would find the answer to this question. Coming out of hyperspace inside the nebula, fleet intelligence noted that the area surrounding them was rich in resources they could use to augment and bolster their fleet. But the energy levels inside this nebula were so high that it affected the sensors of every ship in the fleet, providing a convenient way to effectively ambush the Kushans if someone wished to do so. But the riches of the nebula were too tempting, and Fleet Command ordered harvesting operations to begin immediately. They would take what they could before continuing their journey out of the nebula. However, there was something hiding out in the gases that was watching them, and which also took offense to the exiles' blatant exploitation of their nebula. Not long into the fleet's resourcing operations, an unknown mothership-sized vessel emerged from seemingly nowhere, and was on an intercept course with a fleet of exiles. Per standard procedure for the Kushans, they sent out a lone ambassador ship to greet the strange visitor. The new ship, in turn, also proceeded to do the same by sending out a strike craft-sized ship. Once both representatives met, the unknown visitor immediately explained that this nebula they were in was the Garden of Kadeshi. For 13 generations, they protected it from trespassers and those that would defile the nebula. The Kadeshi diplomat then gave them two choices: join them in the garden or die. The Kushan ambassador, maintaining his composure, replied that they did not know the significance of this place and that his people meant no conflict. And once the mothership hyperspace module was fully charged again, they would leave without further provocation. But this was not good enough for the Kadeshi. If the Kushan would not join them, the only option was death. For in the words of the Kadeshi ambassador, no one withdraws from the garden. Following these failed attempts at negotiations, both ambassadors withdrew back to their respective motherships. But the Kadeshi, true to their threats, began deploying their own strike craft en masse, the Swarmers. And in a frightening amount of time, the number of Kadeshi craft seemed to almost block out the light from the nebula. Making matters worse, the Kadeshi mothership was emitting a hyperspace inhibitor field that would prevent the Kushans from escaping, even once their own hyperspace module was fully charged. Strangely, it was quickly noticed by Kushan analysts that this technology they used was almost identical to their own. But there was little time to dwell on this, as the approaching Kadeshi left the exiles with only two options: fight or be destroyed. Throwing themselves headfirst into the Kadeshi, the Kushan ships fought with a zeal that easily rivaled the numbers of their enemies. But slowly, the tide of battle began turning against them. For every swarmer that was destroyed, two more seemed to take their place, and the Kushan mothership could not replace their losses so quickly. But a glimmer of hope was discovered amongst the Kadeshi swarms. Their strike craft could not match the range or operational flight time of their own Kushan equivalents, and thus needed mobile fuel pods to keep their ships operational mid-battle. If these fuel pod ships were destroyed, more and more of the Kadeshi swarmers would be rendered out of action as the slugging match between the two fleets wore on. Capitalizing on this, Fleet Command ordered their forces to prioritize the Kadeshi fuel ships, which the Kushan strike craft happily obliged, inevitably destroying their ponderous targets. But the Kadeshi continued to fight on and overwhelm the Kushan fleet. However, little by little during the fighting, the seemingly unending clouds of swarmers began to thin and eventually dissipate entirely. The plan had worked, leaving the Kadeshi mothership unguarded from the bloodied Kushan warriors eager to put this meat grinder of a battle behind them and leave this nebula at last. It did not take long for the Kadeshi mothership to realize that they would face certain death if they stayed here with the Kushans, and began preparations to hyperspace out of the area. The exiles had triumphed. After a brief pause to resume their resourcing operations and repair and refit the fleet, the mothership began setting a course out of the nebula, ready to emerge into the galaxy outside of this so-called Garden of Kadesh. But when they came out of hyperspace yet again, Fleet Command and Intelligence quickly realized that they were still in the nebula. The same hyperspace inhibitor technology used against them previously was being utilized yet again to pull them out of hyperspace by another Kadeshi mothership detected nearby. Again, a representative from the Kadeshi was sent to make overtures for peace, stating that the Kushans could still live among them in the garden. Karen Sajet, deciding to take a direct hand in diplomacy, replied that they could not stay, as they were on a journey to find their home. But she implored the Kadeshi that there could still be peace between their two peoples. She then shared the revelation discovered by the Kushans in the battle prior, that their hyperspace technology was similar to their own, and that perhaps they were long-lost brothers and sisters who once shared the same homeworld. The Kadeshi merely replied that they would fail, and that the evil that drove them here to find refuge would destroy the Kushans without challenge. And when that evil would finish with them, they would uncover the existence of the Kadeshi and do the same to their people. If they were to survive, their only option was to destroy the Kushan and prevent them from leaving the nebula. To accentuate this point, Fleet Intelligence immediately reported that multiple enemy units were closing in on their position, including 2 more Kadeshi motherships, making the odds 3-1 against them. Any notion of peace between the two star-faring races had apparently evaporated into the nebular gases that surrounded them. Again, despite their overwhelming swarms, the Kushan fleet was able to turn the tables on the Kadeshi strike craft. eventually destroying 2 of their motherships. The last survivor, realizing the tide had turned, began retreating with its forces deeper into the nebula for a desperate last stand. But there, unknown to the Kushans, a whole new mystery was to reveal itself. As the Kushan mothership was tracking the movements of the Kadeshi survivors, their sensors began detecting a friendly signature similar to the ones emitted by their own Kushan Fleet. And yet, they had no ships operating in that area. Regardless, the Kushans rallied for a final push and began advancing towards the fleeing Kadeshi. But as the fleet closed in on them, the reason why the Kushan mothership had detected a friendly signature in this part of space was answered. The signal was coming from the Khar-Toba. But obviously that couldn't be the case. The Khar-Toba, the transport ship that carried the Kushans during the first exodus millennia ago, was destroyed along with the rest of Karak. This derelict ship the Kadeshi were basing their final stand around must have been traveling with their Khar-Toba at some point during the first exile from the Homeworld. Of course, this mystery would have to wait, as the last remnants of the Kadeshi fleet stood defiant against the Kushan ships approaching them, still fully intent on burying the exiles in their garden. From the smallest strike craft to the largest super capital ship, the Kushans tore through the Kadeshi, their eagerness to end this trial in the nebula being reflected in the ferocity of their war-fighting abilities against the Gardeners of Kadesh. And with the hard-won experience the exiles had gained in fighting with the Kadeshi before, the last of their warriors could no longer hope to stave off the certainty of their own destruction. And in a short but furious battle, the Gardeners of Kadesh were finally broken. As the debris of the Kadeshi swarms began floating back into the garden they once worshipped, the mothership and her fleet began preparations to hyperspace out of the nebula. But not before they did a thorough analysis of this new Khar-Toba, and the results they found were astounding. The still intact databanks indicated that for unknown reasons, this ship parted ways with the original Khar-Toba to take refuge inside the nebula, which their databanks called Kadesh. These exiles survived by scavenging from their ship and harvesting the nebula to sustain their existence, but even this would quickly prove to not be enough. As such, the Kadeshi began resorting to pirating supply ships that would travel through the nebula. Any sense of fair play or mercy was quickly abolished by these new raiders, who remembered their treatment by the galactic community during the exile from Megara. Each captured ship made the Kadeshi stronger, allowing them to take on bigger and more lucrative targets passing through the nebula. All the while, not one being in the galaxy had the faintest idea who these new attackers were, not even the Bentusi. But as the Kadeshi raids grew in aggression, the Taiidani Empire, unable to stop these attacks, eventually outlawed their ships from passing through the nebula entirely, with the other galactic powers adopting similar policies, as the risk had far since outweighed the reward. But the Kadeshi were now faced with a crisis. Without a steady supply of new ships to prey on, they began turning inward towards the nebula, harvesting what they could at great cost. They began forming what came to be the modern Kadeshi fleet. 3 mothership-sized vessels called home ships were constructed to house their people, along with countless hordes of strike craft to safeguard them. Of course, there were always still ship captains who favored themselves bold enough to cross the nebula, regardless of the stories. And every one of them would learn to regret their decision when a Kadeshi ship would inevitably intercept their vessels and present an impossible choice: join them or die. Eventually, this modus operandi of the Kadeshi began taking on religious tones as over the long years history became myth. They were no longer raiders trying to survive in hiding, but gardeners tending to the great nebula, while punishing those who would dare trespass in this holy place. The findings from this other Khar-Toba were shocking to the Kushans. All this time they had been fighting their wayward brothers and sisters from Megara, separated by millennia and by the expanse of space. But once again, there would be time to ponder these revelations later. Megara was out there somewhere in the Inner Rim, and the exiles' journey was still far from over. While they had successfully bypassed the Taiidani defenses, the Kushans were now very much inside the heart of the Taiidani Empire. No one would be able to predict what deadly surprises the mad Emperor Ristu IV II would unleash on the Exiles' fleet to prevent them from finding Higara. The Homeworld War was beginning to escalate.